Well, I'd like to welcome you all here to the American Enterprise Institute in this beautiful new building. My name is Robert Kaplan. I'm a senior fellow at the Center for New American Security, also in Washington. And with me today is Michael Auslin, the author of a new book. And it's not just a new book, it's really the big book on Asia that a lot of us have been waiting for, in the sense that it covers Asia from top to bottom, from Japan to India to Australia and everywhere in between. And it has a very provocative thesis, as I'll get to. First of all, 1 out of 3 people in the world are Indian or Chinese descent. Think about that for a minute. A war in Asia could destroy the world economy. We've had tragic wars in Iraq, in Syria, in Libya, and financial markets around the world have just shrugged them off, essentially. They've counted them in, they've factored them in, and that's it. But you have a war in the South China Sea or the East China Sea, financial markets will go haywire, and all of our bank accounts will be affected. So Asia really matters. It's a place of big populations, big militaries, modernizing militaries, and the geographical organizing principle of the world economy, if the world economy has one specific geographical organizing principle. And now tell me, Misha, tell us about this book, because it's a very provocative thesis that you have, that Asia is not just a success story for people in business suits to fly there in business class. There's more going on there.
Well, first, Bob, thank you for taking time to come and join me today, and thank you to all of you for coming here to our new building. This is my first time actually in this room, let alone doing an event here. So if I'm trying to figure out if the chair swivels or looking at you, you'll know I'm learning it. So I think that the timing is really right for a reassessment on Asia, and that's sometimes a hard case to make because there's so much else going on around in the world. I mean, as a city, we've been consumed for 15 plus years with the Middle East. Recently, we've been more consumed with Europe and Russia sort of returning from what we thought was its post-Cold War slumber. And through all of that, we thought that the good news was Asia. And in fact, I went out to write a book about the good news on Asia. I wanted to write a book about how America's future really needed to be an Asian one, that we had to change our DNA, which was very Atlanticist in origin, and instead accept that the opportunities of the future were all going to be in Asia. Yeah. I had been dealing with it for 25 years and had lived there for a number of years and traveled all around, and so I started going out to gather the evidence for that. And if you remember the old radio announcer Paul Harvey, what I discovered was the rest of the story. And that was going to all these different countries and having people that I assume were just going to sell me on the Asian miracle talk to me instead about the problems, their fears, their worries, the things we weren't paying attention to, which I certainly wasn't prepared to get. And in many cases, I'm not an expert in a lot of these things, but they kept coming at me. And so after a little bit of resistance, the idea of the book shifted away from what was going to be an American future that was conjoined with Asia to what I ultimately came to call the end of the Asian century, that we had to have a reassessment of where Asia was going. And before I go further, and I know you have a bunch of other questions, but before I go farther, I just want to say the book is not predictive. I'm not predicting war. I'm not predicting economic collapse. I'm not predicting revolution, but it is a diagnosis of all these different issues and all these different trends, most of which, again, were new to me. So things I had to try to understand, how does this fit into the accepted narrative and the common wisdom we had on Asia, although if you went and talked to the real experts in town, they knew these things, right? The folks who were writing the really detailed reports, they knew what was coming up. My colleague, Nick Eberstadt, who writes on the demographics, has been warning us for years about demographics. He's known about that. My colleague, Derek Scissors, who's been looking at the stalling out of the Chinese economy, he's been writing about that. but it hadn't really percolated through to the common wisdom. And so being a common sort of guy, I figured I might as well write a book for me that would tell me what was going on in Asia, and that's really it. I'll stop because I know you have the other questions. I'll just mention that the way we put together the book with my research team, which is wonderful RAs and interns who helped enormously with this, was to try to figure out what does risk Asia look like. You know, if we pulled up a map, I guess we have enormous screens. I didn't even notice them, gigantic screens. We could have had really cool maps up here for Asia. But if we put up a map of Asia, we all know what it looks like. We know what the shapes are and what the seas are. Instead, I wanted to look at what a risk map of Asia would look like. And to do that, I charted out 5 risk regions, and those are really the 5 chapters of the book: economics, demographics, domestic politics, regional politics, and security. And so the book sort of walks you through this, Lord of the Rings fantasy map to tell you this is what all the problems are. And again, without being predictive, but trying to say a very simple message: don't be surprised.
Well, it's not predictive, but it's a very troubling book. And it's troubling in a good way, because it really rivets you in, and it's not, I find that Asia was given to a certain kind of romanticism, not the kind of romanticism you see in Africa or other parts of the world. It was what I call an economic romanticism. I remember reading in Newsweek and Time, when they used to be great magazines, in the 1970s, traveling around the world, about the Asian economic miracle. Remember the Pacific Tigers? That was the first word about that. And Asia was a place that was growing by double-digit economies, and therefore the future was great, so to speak. But you paint not only a more nuanced picture, but actually a picture that tracks with Sam Huntington's The Clash of Civilizations, because everyone has an opinion on that book. Very few people have actually read it, And one of the things he writes in that book, one of the main themes, is that civilizational clash, ethnic clash, there's nothing primordial about it. It's all about modernism. It's a crisis of modernism. That as peoples develop, the tension between groups get harder edged, not softer, because they're fighting for components of the marketplace, whereas before they didn't. So can you go into this a bit?
I think that's exactly right. The part of the problems that I think we have in understanding what's going on in Asia is that it flies in the face of what we've accepted is the narrative of development for societies as they become richer, as they trade with each other, as they talk to each other more, they modernize, raise people up into the middle class. It's that disputes, whether internally or externally, are mediated, and that you come up with mechanisms for doing so because you understand it's in your self-interest. You suddenly have too much to lose at a personal level, a local level, or an international level even. We see the opposite in many cases in Asia. And again, just to take a quarter step back, I in no way deny, of course, the enormous growth and successes that Asia's had. Let me just put that out. This is not a book that says what you thought you knew about China is wrong. No, I mean, if you go to Shanghai and you look at the buildings, they're really there, right? If you look at an incredibly fertile middle class in South Korea or in Japan or in China, they are there. Again, this is trying to fill in the other side of the story. And what we expected was to see a region that had figured out how to solve these problems internally and externally. And instead, I think the evidence, at least there's enough of it coming through, that we may have to recalculate what we thought the trajectory for Asia was and return to something that is more in line with Huntington's thesis, that there is going to be more struggle over what is perceived as either limitations of resources or for power or for space on the international stage. This, I think, confounds us. Part of our mental template is Europe post-World War II. It's that even the bitterest enemies who fought catastrophic wars twice in a generation can come together and solve problems. And instead, when you look at Asia, and of course there has not been a catastrophic war in Asia since 1945, but that they are moving in the wrong direction. So that Asia today, I would argue, is closer to some type of armed conflict than it was 5 or 10 years ago. Internally, many of these states are more fragile than they were 5 or 10 years ago, even with the economic growth that we've seen. Some of these things I think require, it's sort of your own interpretation. Is it a good thing or a bad thing that the South Korean president was impeached last month? If you believe in the voice of the people, then you think it's a good thing. You think it's a good thing that 1 million people went out into the streets. If you have a slightly more pessimistic disposition, you might look at it and say, well, this really points to some serious fragility in the South Korean political system, and a sense on the part of 1 million people that they had to get into the streets because there was no other way to express their dissatisfaction. I don't think there's not a single answer to it, and it's something that's being played out. But the negatives that we have too often, I think, discounted in this period, which has been all of our lives, this enormous growth in Asia, now will be the narrative going forward. I think that's the story, is that we will stop thinking as much about a strong, growing Asia, and we'll begin worrying about a weakening Asia.
Yeah, and I would add that sustained capitalist growth leads to military acquisitions. It sounds ironic and counterintuitive, but it's true. Because the more a capitalist growth there is, the more a country has trading interests around the world, the more it wants to protect those interests, and then questions of status enter into it. It's wealthier, it's bigger, so it wants an army, it wants a navy, it wants missiles and air force. And this was pointed out by Paul Bracken, the Yale professor, in his 1999 book about Asia.
Yeah, fire in the rim,
fire in the something.
Yeah.
But it was excellent. All right, let's go around Asia.
Sure.
Let's discuss China. The last 30 years in China, we've had it good. The United States. We've had boring, non-charismatic, collegial, technocratic leadership, which were averse to risks. Since Mao, since Deng Xiaoping, there's been no personality cult or anything. And these were all people who were engineers. They had experience in the provinces. They were doers, not abstract theorists. So they were less prone to extremism and all that. But what are the next 30 years are going to be like? Because Xi Jinping has already broken that mold.
That's right. I think that will be for us, again, the big story, because our focus has been on China for so long. There's been so much investment in China that's both of a financial nature but also a political nature, an emotional nature. If you started, as I did with Japan, 25 years ago plus, you saw that country, which if we were doing this book back then, we'd say, Japan was the country that was going to take over the West and take over the world. You saw it eclipsed, and it's really been a China story. And I think you're exactly right, Bob, to point out that the last 30 years were, in a way, easy. And look, you have to give enormous credit to the party, to the Chinese Communist Party and the government for shepherding China to the position where it is today. But that era is over. And I think if a few minutes ago I mentioned that our big preoccupation will be not a growing Asia but a weakening Asia, then it's even more appropriate to label that with China, that we will start thinking less about a strong China and much more about a weakening China. And a weakening China can be just as much of a problem, if not more of a problem, than a growing China is. But I think over the past, starting when I began all of this, obviously I was a professor, I was a historian, I wasn't thinking of it in terms of policy, but we've become very good, I think, over the last 25 years in thinking about and trying to figure out what a strong and growing China looks like. What does it mean economically? What does it mean politically? We began to grapple with that from a military and security sense. We need to come up with a different set of analytical tools, and that is, what does a stagnating or weakening China look like? At a minimum, to protect us. It's a hedging strategy for ourselves, so we're not caught by surprise. But more so, I think that there is a legitimate case to be made that whether you look at the domestic politics, the economics, the external relations, that China is going to face far more problems going forward. And some of it may be masked. It may come out in what we think of as sort of flamboyant activities or actions to show that they're not losing their space, that in fact they're as powerful as they were before. But it does center in many cases going forward on Xi Jinping. We will find out sooner rather than later, if he really does intend to step down after 10 years, if he has irrevocably altered the nature of collective leadership, if he has really built up what is a nascent cult of personality that indeed may be put into play in order to provide him with popular support. When the stories broke about the Bo Xilai case, which was about 2012, and suddenly this veil on some of the corruption in China was really laid bare before the world, and most importantly laid bare before the Chinese people, who were finding out about it on social media and Sino Weibo and things like that. The response, of course, was, well, we're going to have this anti-corruption campaign. It's going to be a way to prove that the leadership really does care about its responsibilities, cares about the people, is going to live up to maxims about responsible governance. And yet, at the same time, there were those warning that this is also being used by Xi Jinping as a way to solidify his own power, as a way to get rid of alternate power centers, as a way to control the army, corral the PLA, to control the press, to crack down on civil society. If you talk with your friends from China, as almost everyone in this room does, I think all of them tell us that they feel more concerned now about the trajectory of Chinese domestic society and what it will look like going forward. That has spillover implications, I think, for the rest of the region. There are concerns. It's not just, does China, for example, kidnap a British passport holder from a third-party country because he is a publisher who's publishing books critical of Xi Jinping? That's one level. There's an entirely different level of what types of actions and intimidation do you potentially take in order to tell smaller countries with whom you have territorial disputes, don't test us. Ultimately, I think it all reverberates back into the center of power. It reverberates back into who has control.
All right. A weaker China internally, can it become, as a reaction, more aggressive externally in the South and East China Sea?
Absolutely. I think as a historian, you never want to predict, but I think you often see a cycle where early on, in order to precisely forestall the impression that you're weakening or losing power or have trouble at home, you are more assertive abroad or belligerent abroad. You export some of your troubles, but you certainly put up a facade. If you're not solving those internal problems, though, if you really get to a point where you are, in essence, threatened with your survival, either as an individual or as a regime, then at some point you decide the external game is not worth it anymore. You really do have to focus internally. So in the short run, I think U.S. policymakers, the Trump administration coming in, should certainly be prepared for a China that continues what President Obama himself called its aggression in the South China Sea, what others label belligerence or assertiveness at a minimum. This is a message to us as much as it is to the smaller countries with which China has these disputes. And if the sense is, China's a wounded beast and now's your time to strike to get your little bit of territory back, then China wants to forestall it. I think if you knit together a lot of what Xi Jinping has been saying in recent months about foreign policy, you come up with a Xi doctrine. In essence, he's talked about keeping peace on the Korean Peninsula. China will not allow the Korean Peninsula to descend into chaos. It will protect its maritime interests and maintain peace in the South China Sea. It obviously will not allow any types of separatism to proceed in China in territories that it claims, Xinjiang, Tibet, Hong Kong, Taiwan, and the like. In totality, I think this is becoming the Xi doctrine, and I think we should take it very seriously.
Yeah. If you were to have a quiz game and isolate the one issue in the world that has bigger throw weight on many other issues, I would not say the Iran nuclear program or other things in the Middle East. I would say what's going to happen with the Chinese economy over the next half decade or so. That's going to affect world geopolitics more than any individual thing elsewhere.
I think that's right. And for us, it's the catch-up game with that. It's getting a better sense, as people here and in other places are trying to do, of really what the numbers are. What can we really understand about where the Chinese economy is going? Because it will affect everything from investment patterns, trading patterns, to the amount of money they put into their military. Look, for the first time in over 20 years, the Chinese military budget dropped below 10% annual increase last year. That was long after the economy had slowed down to 7, 6, maybe 5%. We don't really know. But there is a catch-up. Now, given China's size, it's still going to be far larger than any other player in the region. Everyone knows that. But for each other country, either from an economic perspective or a political and military perspective, it's a relative issue. It's your own personal relationship, so to speak, with China, and where you feel you can or cannot get advantage. So this slowdown is exactly right. It's affecting the economies of these nations, as China has slowed its buying of raw materials, for example, tipping some of them towards a recessionary nature. And in fact, Australia as well, which hasn't had a recession for 25 years, almost had one a few years ago because of the dramatic drop in Chinese purchase of raw materials.
And I guess it depends, not will China's economy continue to decelerate? We know it will, but to what degree it will, because that will determine what kind of domestic unrest, if any, China has internally.
Yeah, exactly, and I think it's connected with the demographic question. A country that is going to get older, as Japan is already losing population, South Korea will be, Taiwan, all the developed economies and societies are at below demographic replacement. China, because of the one-child policy, which has been repealed, but first of all, there are still restrictions, and it will take time to get more people in to the workforce, is going to be facing that as well. I think, I'm not an economist, but I do think that, we focus on headlines, and probably it's less useful for us to focus on, will China have a hard landing or not, and instead look seriously at what this unquestionable long-term slowdown will mean structurally for China, and therefore for the rest of the region. Let's not worry if it's going to be, a hard landing, which is 2% or whatever that means, and will there be rioters in the streets yet. It's more, how is China going to be changing from the path that we projected it going on for a long time? It's things we should have done with Japan 20 years ago, 25 years ago, that we didn't do as well. And at very different stages of development, obviously, but we didn't do it with Japan. I mean, the whole book is just to say, let's not be surprised by this stuff. Let's at least be aware of it, so we can think about it. If you're an investor or a policymaker or a military official, these are the things to think about, so you don't suddenly start scrambling.
Yeah, business people don't mind bad news. They just don't like being surprised by bad news, is the way I would put it. Let's move on. Let's talk about Japan. You have a sentence or a paragraph in the book where you say, what is next after Abe?
Yeah.
What is there anything? So Japan seems to be like the one bright spot among U.S. allies around the world. I mean, when you look at the shape Germany's in, or France, or Britain, Japan seems to be a bright spot.
Yeah, this book's all about bad news, though, so let's not talk about the good news in Japan. It is controversial to talk about, in some ways, how well Japan is doing, or that it is the bright spot. I'll just say that as someone who has been dealing with Japan for 25 plus years, full on, that I was very much a Japan skeptic for a long time, having watched the way that it sort of floated through the 90s and 2000s. And in all honesty, after doing this book and traveling through most of Asia and then writing the book and sort of thinking about it, I really became much more bullish on Japan overall, which isn't to say it doesn't have enormous problems, the demographic problem above all, problems that continue with political participation, lack of voter enthusiasm, the restrictions that, first of all, too much government meddling in the economy, social restrictions, gender issues. I mean, Japan has the gamut of issues that any country faces, but it also has, I think, begun dealing with a lot of them, at least in small ways that ameliorate some of the bigger problems. And overall, as much as as I can be optimistic, I'm pretty optimistic about Japan. the question of Abe is really a big one. Obviously, there will be something after Abe. We don't know what that will be. And we don't have to worry about it until 2021. He'll be in office for 9 full years. He changed the rules so he could stay 3 more years. And this is going to be unprecedented in post-war Japanese history. We've never had a leader be in office that long. And I would argue, whether you like what he's doing or not, a leader with a plan. He has a plan. A lot of it, especially on the economic side, has been less successful than we wanted to see, but he is pushing forward. Clearly on the security and military and political side, he's been more successful pushing forward. One other thing to note, by the way, when President-elect Trump takes office next Friday, Shinzo Abe will be the first Japanese leader who will be creating hopefully what he hopes will be a positive, close relationship with his second U.S. president. When you think about the other leaders we talk about in Japan post-war, Koizumi Junichiro, who was with George W. Bush, or Nakasone Yasuhiro, who was with Ronald Reagan, they only had those presidents. So this is a little bit also unprecedented for Japan, is that you made a good relationship against all odds in a way with Obama. Now you have to do it with Trump. And you saw that Abe was the first foreign leader to call Trump and say, I want to meet you, and give credit to him for grabbing the opportunity, and honestly give credit to President-elect Trump for saying, yeah, I'll meet you. It's a very busy time, but I'll meet you. So for Japan, I think this shows, again, that it is I don't want to say in the driver's seat, but it has a confidence you haven't seen for a long time, recognizing its limitations and the problems it faces. But Abe really feels he has an opportunity to advance Japan's interests with us and with a lot of the countries in the region.
All right, let's move on to the Korean Peninsula. One could argue that North Korea is not simply a communist regime, it's a national fascist regime. And that its enemies are not just South Korea, but as Asia specialists know, Japan also to a significant degree. Now, to my mind, no previous president going back a quarter century has handled North Korea well. I mean, there's been no success in North Korea. But the problem seems worse now because of their missile development program. So what do you expect might happen? What are some alternative scenarios for North Korea over the first term of the incoming Trump administration?
Well, I think the first place to start, we have a room full of, I see a lot of my colleagues here who know Korea better than I do and have worked on it for decades. I think the first step, if we're in a sort of 12-step Korea program, is to admit that we have no good solutions. We have to accept that. We've maneuvered ourselves. They've maneuvered us into a point where we have no good solutions. We missed a lot of windows to do things that at the time seemed too risky and too even immoral to stop them from developing a ballistic missile, and particularly a nuclear program. And we chose not to do that. Chose other paths or did not choose other paths to try and push about regime change, which obviously is a very risky and dangerous and controversial path. But at least we do have some data that shows us what happens when you don't do that. As analysts, all of us here, we now have some data to say, if you choose to be risk averse, and that's a completely logical and acceptable position, if you choose to be risk averse, at least be aware of where that may bring you. And that's where we are with North Korea today. Specifically to your answer, I don't think they're going to break their pattern of challenging a U.S. president. In fact, we had the announcement over the weekend about the fact they have an ICBM that can hit us, whether they do or not. They're moving closer to it. That's not a statement they could have made 10 years ago. They can make it today with some credibility. The fact that they have a nuclear program, that's a very credible program right now. The question of whether you declare North Korea a nuclear state and therefore you put at risk elements of the non-proliferation regime, at some point we're going to have to wake up and face reality about what capabilities they have. I don't think there's anyone in this room or in the city who would argue for a preemptive or precipitous attack on North Korea. But I do think that the fact that they have been able to repeatedly get away with provocations with very little very little cost of any kind, has been a Pavlovian lesson for them, and they know what they can do. And so we're in a riskier situation, but the question is, do you accept some more risk now in order to prevent what you consider to be a worsening situation? I think we would need to do that. Certainly, well, South Korea today, with the political crisis, is an open question, but after the 2010 Waipido and the Chonan sinking and the Waipido bombings, or shelling, South Korea made very clear, one more incident and then this will be a clear war. How are we going to be working with them, and if something does happen, which we assume it will?
Yeah. Let's do not a lightning round, but
Yeah.
let's go around the region to take in some more countries. What about India? U.S. relations with India. Relations with India are very complex because they're on so many different levels. I always felt you needed somebody high up in the administration to take a particular interest in India for it to go forward.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. If you talk to, I remember talking to one of the former commanders of Pacific Command who was marveling at, even in his time in office or in the post, how much our relations with India had developed. And whereas you couldn't get Indian officials on the phone 10 or 15 years ago, today, we're doing Malabar exercises together, and we have a whole host of cooperative ventures. And probably, I would say the high point to me seems to be during the Bush administration, the civil nuclear deal, which of course ultimately fell apart, and then it's coming back, and you have all these different moving parts to what was really a domestic issue in India. There were always disappointments, even as we were trying to figure out what does the look east and now the act east policy really mean.
Yeah.
We thought of it naturally as the great democratic counterweight. You have Japan in the east of Asia, and you have India in the west of Asia, and the twain shall meet somewhere over China potentially, and you'll have this sort of new commonwealth of democratic nations. India has a very clear tradition of foreign policy that maintains a level of distance, even while it has increasingly worked with partners. I think that the best we can do and the best we should be doing is a consistent engagement with India at a high level, at the highest level, and expressing our desire that they get more involved in a whole host of issues, from providing public goods to civil society to greater economic integration. It would be an incredibly missed opportunity if we were not to go along those lines, but at the same time, it has to be tempered by realism.
The Philippines, and Vietnam, Malaysia, the countries of the South China Sea, where the U.S. has problems with all of them, often because of a human rights element or a corruption element, which gets in the way of our strategy.
Right. I think that with Southeast Asia, this is an area where clearly the Obama administration put an enormous amount of effort to its credit and came up with a lot of agreements, some of which are at risk, some of which are going through. And it was a very good thing for the president himself, I think, to be expressing his own level of commitment and interest in Southeast Asia, which is a region, honestly, that often gets sort of slips between the cracks. If you're teaching it, you teach it in East Asian Studies or a South Asian Studies department. There aren't as many Southeast Asian studies. In the government, sometimes it sort of falls through the cracks. So the Obama administration did a very good job, I think, in raising it to a level of where people had to really take account of it. The question, of course, is what the ultimate end result of that was, and in some ways, I think you have to say that it was to make China less of a cooperative partner in that region, because it felt its own interests were threatened. And we see China actively acting to, or actively trying to peel away some of our partners in the region. Certainly the Philippines, the opportunity with Duterte, the recent agreements with Malaysia, where the corruption issue comes into play because of Najib's corruption problems. Australia, even, a very close and important ally, but which has stepped back a little bit, and that's connected with trade ties. I don't think it's out of the realm of possibility, again, not to predict, but to say that by the end of, let's say, this year, sometime in the middle of next year, we may look around Asia and, for better or worse, sort of think, you know what, Japan's really the only ally we've got going on a sort of day-to-day basis. Again, the Philippines, just too much of a wild card. Australia, as I mentioned. Thailand with the junta and the coup, it restricts what we can do with them. And if you get a more left-wing government in South Korea, which seems likely, the question is how far left? How does that impact the alliance? How much do they lean towards China or North Korea? You really may wake up in the Trump administration may wake up in DC one day and go, wow, for things I want to do like freedom of navigation, for governance issues, civil society issues, I really sort of have one ally. I don't want to make it sound so dire, but you're right, Bob, to point out we have real issues with Southeast Asia, which maybe, if you want to be positive, is a good thing in the sense only that we never looked at it as much as we did today. Yeah. Now we're looking at it, and so now we see the problems, but we're going to have to solve them, and I think it's going to require even more engagement than what we've been doing.
Okay. Since 1945, the United States has more or less imposed order in Asia. The Asian economic boom, which began in the 70s, would have been impossible without the Seventh Fleet there. Right. Because security could be taken for granted, more or less. It allowed the people to concentrate on their domestic economies and to develop them. There is no NATO. And sometimes when I'm in Honolulu, I get the feeling that Pacific Command is like Brussels. It's the replacement for NATO, or because everyone comes to PACOM with their problems. Given that we're at a change of administrations, given that the Obama administration announced with much fanfare a pivot, they renamed it a rebalance, but now we have the Chinese declaring an air defense identification zone in the East China Sea, building artificial islands in the South China Sea, building airstrips and hangars and missile emplacements on them. What has the pivot accomplished, or let me, to be more charitable to President Obama, the pivot was an aspiration. After the Cold War, with the focus on Europe, after the Iraq invaded Kuwait in a no-fly zone for 12 years, after the Afghan war, the Iraq war, the pivot was a way of saying we're not going to go isolationist now. We're just going to still stay engaged in another region.
Yeah, I'm probably not the first person to say, well, if you want me to grade it, it's an incomplete at best, right?
Yeah.
But that's with all policy. All policies are incomplete. I don't think by the time that Harry Truman left office that the Marshall Plan was fully, you could have judged it necessarily. Probably you could have, but anyway, for the point of argument, these things play out over years and decades, and ultimately you see whether it has brought you to the point where you want to be. I think the biggest criticism of the pivot will not be certainly the aspirational part, as you said, the rhetorical part, which is very important. It's an easy, cheap shot that I think I'm sure I took, all of us take, that it was all rhetoric and no action. Rhetoric's important. You have to be clear about what you care about and why you care about it. So the rhetoric was good. The things that were done were good. It's good to have Marines in the Air Force in Australia. It's good to do more with Singapore. If Duterte doesn't completely scotch it, I think it'll be really good to have access back into the Philippines. There's lots of good things that you can do that the pivot was meant to do. I think the biggest criticism I always heard from the Asians going when I was there is that they would say, but how has it changed anything on the ground or on the sea? The actual day-to-day trend lines that we are worried about, i.e. a growing China, a more assertive China, how has it altered that? And the answer is that it really hasn't, and in some ways, it may have exacerbated it. As President Obama leaves office, we're all worried about President Trump and Taiwan and China, but President Obama is being excoriated by the Chinese for his Asia policy as he leaves office. A major Chinese think tank, most of which, as you know, are connected to the government, a major Chinese think tank just condemned him for his unprecedented aggressive military buildup. It was Chinese papers under President Obama who said there will be war in the South China Sea if the U.S. doesn't back down. And for years, they've been calling his actions destabilizing, not their actions, but his actions destabilizing. So clearly, if it was meant to moderate Chinese behavior, it didn't. And in some ways, it exacerbated it.
Okay, there's a lot we can cover. One last question before I go to the audience.
Great.
You have 5 minutes with President-elect Trump. What do you tell him about Asia? You know, the things to keep in mind. It may not be something so prescriptive as do this and don't do that, or it may be, but what should he know about, you know, the basics about Asia?
So beside read the book.
Yeah,
Which will tell you everything.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, I wrote it because I think these are, the way I wrote it is because I think these are the big things you need to know. So I would tell them in 5 minutes, number one, be prepared for economic turbulence and an economically weaker China than a strong China. You have to think about that. What is that going to mean for us and for the world, as you pointed out? Secondly, be aware of domestic instability all around the region. Again, Korea, it's not over what's happening right now, and we'll have to see how it plays out. That's in a democracy. In an autocracy, be aware of what's going on in the dissent inside of China, or what Duterte is going to be doing internally in the Philippines, which has made it very difficult for us to work with him. So be aware domestically what's going on. And then third, I guess I would just go with the big three. And third is recognize that Asia is closer, which means we are closer to some type of armed confrontation, either through accident or miscalculation, or maybe even calculation, and have a plan. Really understand what are your red lines, what are you willing to defend and not defend, what is important to you and what is not important to you, and who are you going to work with? Because you better be very clear, and you better have a very clear policy before you get engaged in any of that.
Okay, well, thank you. All right, we have over 15 minutes for questions from the audience. Raise your hand, the microphone will come to you, and please, no speeches, just questions, as usual, whatever.
Bob, you're going to moderate the questions.
Yes, over there.
Thank you so much for speaking to all of us.
Can you please just announce your name and what you do, please?
Sure. My name is Joe Murphy. I work at the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation. So my question has to do with recently, more this year in the news, we've seen more about how China is starting to influence Hollywood productions, and it seems to be getting stronger as opposed to weaker. A big media mogul, Wanda, has recently invested more into American film companies. A huge movie that Matt Damon is the star of that China produced just premiered in China called The Great Wall. And I was wondering what you think. Do you think it's any cause of concern that China is starting to influence Hollywood? Is this a positive meshing of cultures, or is this an unhealthy China influeing the U.S.?
I think you've given me my next book topic, because if you write about movies, it's guaranteed to become hopefully a movie. I haven't looked at it. I don't know. I mean, part of it goes to really sort of fundamental economic questions about foreign investment that we want to have. That capital is coming in. We're an attractive place for capital. But the rules have to be very clear and transparent, and you certainly don't want censorship. Being of a certain age, that some of you will understand this. I was very disappointed in the Red Dawn remake, in which it was suddenly North Koreans invading the United States instead of Chinese, because North Koreans really invade us. But apparently it was because of the Chinese pressure or the worry about, will you have this market? So I think there's push and pull on both ends, and I haven't looked at it, but I do think that if there are sort of vetoes that are connected, strings attached, then that's something, it's a private company. This is not a CFIUS level issue. It's not national security, and we have to prevent them from buying, MCA or our leading film producers. But I would assume that at some point, there will be a counter reaction. The Japanese tried this when they tried buying the entertainment companies back in the 80s and the early 90s. It went disastrously for them. And in fact, they wound up divesting most of them because they came in, they didn't understand the culture, and they were money-losing propositions for the Japanese. We'll have to see what the Chinese do. I think one thing, just very quickly on this point, because I want to get to other questions, but this whole idea that China has endless reserves of money to use I think that's one thing we'll have to start recalculating as the economy continues to slow down, as capital flight out of China continues at an incredibly rapid pace. There may just not be as much money out there that they're going to be using to buying up these marquee properties. Certainly the way that the Japanese learned in the 90s, Pebble Beach and Rockefeller Center, and we thought it was the end of America. Within half a decade, it was all over. So, thank you.
All right, another question from this side of the room. Yes.
Paul Marengoff from Powerline. If the trade agreement that Donald Trump is so adamant against gets scuttled, what, if any, will be the geopolitical implications of that?
Thank you, Paul. Appreciate the question. Just today on Foreign Affairs, I put up a piece that tried to address that, which called for a U.S.-Japan free trade agreement if TPP is dead. I mean, I've been one of those very supportive of TPP. I mean, most people in town really are. That's one of the things that Donald Trump clearly ran against. You know, these big, complex, opaque, multilateral trade deals in which sovereignty seemed to be seeping away from the United States. Not a trade lawyer, but if you look at what TPP was designed to do, which was reduce tariffs on U.S. goods, I looked particularly at areas that I knew better, such as Japan and some of the others. This answered questions that we've been trying to get at for 20 years or longer. Dairy, beef, autos, financials, and the like. So I think that TPP is important. I think, first of all, it's important economically for us. I think it's important economically for Asia. As Asia slows down, you want to create more competition and more opportunity there, and that's what it does. There was clearly a strategic element to it. It's something China didn't like. Yeah. But there was a strategic element that you were creating this group of largely free trading nations who would agree to these transparent, high-level pacts. I'm going to say transparent, certainly compared to what China does. But we've been shrinking, right? We've gone from GATT and the Doha round and the World Trade Organization down to regionals, right? So we did TPP, and then we were talking about TTIP. That was the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership. We were already beginning to shrink the scope. If what President-elect Trump is saying, that the era of even these regional trade deals is dead, he has kept the door open to bilaterals. And I think we should take that opportunity. The fact that TPP is dead doesn't mean that free trade is dead. And I think, if anything, what you want to do is maintain as much momentum as you can. I'd like to see a free trade agreement between us and Britain as Britain contemplates its Brexit process. That would probably give some stability to the markets and some stability to predictions about where Britain is going. With Japan, you know, it links up the world's first and third largest economies. They're long. It takes, you know, if you're going to be doing all these bilaterals, it takes a long time to negotiate them. But ultimately, you might, you know, what I would hope is the Trump administration sees the value in them, as the Japanese do, because they don't want to give up TPP, and maybe you begin knitting them together. So I think you play with the hands that you're dealt, and at this point, it might be bilaterals, and we should go forward on that.
Okay. Yes. Yeah.
This is Michael.
Thank you. My name is Barbara Dello, and I had a teacher who in 2010 taught us that China had long felt humiliated at the end of the 20th century, and Mao began a long and continuing course to regain its honor and greatness. Is this still a motivating factor? And do they also have the will to endure sacrifice and internal hard times to accomplish this?
Thank you.
It's a good question. One certainly that Chinese scholars and government officials will repeatedly invoke the century of shame and the century of humiliation. And China is both returning to positions that it held before in terms of international power and influence, as well as in some ways sort of getting its own back, you know, from trying to turn others away from paths that they might have pursued in things like territorial claims, because, you know, China has this, in a way, coming to it from the Western and colonialization era. As a historian, I think that nations' sense of their own history is legitimate. Usually, it's what they feel and believe, and it doesn't help us if we ignore it and we say, well, that's just for public consumption. That's just boilerplate. They really don't feel a century of shame. I mean, if you study East Asian history, you can understand from a Chinese perspective why millennia or so of being literally at the center of a self-understood world, to have that suddenly come to an end and to be partitioned and to undergo multiple civil wars and then the excesses of the Mao era and the like, would cause you to feel that there was a historical period that was one you'd rather forget, and one that began its rebuilding from their perspective with Mao, even with his extraordinary cruelties and excesses, but began and continues today. I think that the biggest problem facing the Chinese government in this process going forward is that it doesn't have the loyalty of the people, especially as the economic picture darkens, and that its legitimacy is eaten away by its repression and oppression at home. This is somewhat analogous to the Soviet Union after World War II, where Stalin saved the Soviet Union, defeated Hitler at costs that none of us as Americans can really comprehend, and it gave an afterlife to a system that was already rotted from within thanks to the purges and collectivization and the like, but it continued it through for decades. China, in a less violent way because of the extraordinary development and growth and modernization over the past several decades, the party has lived off of that. As we now move into a new phase where that is dwindling and slowing down, the question of how the party maintains control, because it's not going to have loyalty of the people, how it maintains control may be the single greatest question that the Chinese leadership faces. And it's the one that we should really be paying attention to.
Yeah, I would just add that China almost disappeared as a state in the 1930s, 1920s. And China felt very strongly about this. It really upset the psychology. And I think bringing back Macau, Hong Kong, clamping down on the Turkic Uyghur Muslims in the West, and trying to take control of the blue water extension of their continental landmass, the South China Sea, is all part of this almost historical reclamation project.
I think that's right. It raises questions. I have nothing to add to that other than to say, for us, I think, particularly on the military side, the strategic or the security side, it raises questions as to how we understand China's own investment in these territories and these areas, right? We think of it, well, number one, we think if push came to shove, we could make these new islands and these bases go away very quickly. But there's a long path between here and where you get there. How China actually perceives these as sovereign pieces of territory that it is going to defend with all national means, or are they more bargaining chips, or what? We haven't really begun to ask those questions, right? And I think that goes to everything from naval doctrine to nuclear doctrine. When the Chinese tell us, look, this isn't just an island base. We've got a post office here. We've got schools here. There's going to be little Chinese children running around these islands. They're sending messages about how they view these pieces of territory that are going to factor into their strategic thinking. We need to start thinking about it as well.
Yes, over there.
Alexei Savchenko, private citizen. For last decades, Russians were paranoid about so-called yellow peril. They have plenty of empty lands full of all kind of riches, and China, which is overpopulated, sitting next door. On the other hand, recently, there is a great deal of rapprochement between Russia and China, and Putin is playing China's card against the West. What you said, does it imply that Russians are out of trouble, and there is no chance that Chinese eventually, one or the other way, are going to take over the territories of Eastern Siberia and Russian Far East? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. I think that we as Americans always think of Russia in a European context. I started studying Asia actually looking at Russia in Asia, and there's a completely different history. There's a completely different Asian context for Russia that we don't often think about, if ever. And when you look at it from that perspective, it, for example, answers the question as to why Shinzo Abe, a strong ally of the United States, has such good relations with Putin, which causes our European friends often no end of concern and being distraught over. It's because Russia plays a different role in Asia than it does in Europe. It is not threatening in Asia the way it is in Europe. Rather, in Asia, it can be the spoiler. It can be the balancer. As you said, Putin is playing China against the West. Well, Japan has reached out to Putin in order to try to balance against China. China does it in order to block Japan. That said, though, and I think especially when you look at the history, these are two very large, mostly continental nations that do not trust each other, have never gotten along, share a very long border, which is a recipe for mischief, and have fought over that border. I think any type of rapprochement between Moscow and Beijing is always one of opportunism. I don't think there are any shared interests between the two personally. And that when there's a better deal that comes along, they will move on to better partners. One reason that I think, for example, Russia is reinvesting in its Pacific fleet and reinvesting in bolstering defenses in the Kuril Islands has nothing to do with Japan. I honestly don't believe that Russia is worried about Japan. It's worried about China. It's worried about Arctic trade routes. It's worried about the PLAN moving ever northward and ultimately wanting to circumnavigate from Shanghai over to Hamburg, which cuts about 13 days off the trip to ship goods. And those are waters that Russia claims. It wants to control those waters. It wants the ability to control those waters even in the international sphere. So I think that the longer-term dynamic is one of competition, and as you point out, the fact that I think it's the most far eastern oblasts, you have maybe 6 million people in Russia, and in just the 3 provinces on the border, you have 100 million Chinese. And so, regardless of how well they get along, and there's fluidity, that very fluidity is of concern to Russians who know that this is essentially an open territory with enormous raw materials and reserves that China needs: water, timber, minerals.
Okay, we have time for 2 more quick questions. There. Yeah.
Hi, Pat Span, just myself. You touched on it a moment ago. What do you see as the end game in the South China Sea? If you look at the 9-dash map, it looks like a Chinese lake. Do they expect? Are they going to set up toll booths? So if your ships passing through there have to get their permission and pay a toll, or what do you see the end game in the South China Sea?
Well, there's a couple of ways to answer the question, and it's probably the driving, strategic question we're thinking about in terms of Asia. There's what do the Chinese want the end game to be? What do we want the end game to be? Again, as a historian, I'm loath to ever, say, well, this is what's going to happen. These evolve. I tend to look at it, if I can just mention this. You remember the old history books? And you turn to them, and in like your school textbooks, and there'd be a page of maps, right? It'd be divided into 4. There'd be 4 maps of the same region, right? And one would be, let's say, 1800, and then 1850, 1875, 1900, right? And on each map, the colors changed because the territory was changing, right? And the map represents a century's worth of history. We're just at the beginning of this process in the South China Sea and Asia, in a way. But we've gone from map 1 to map 2. We've gone from map 1 that was basically 1945 to, let's say, 2010. And now we're in map 2. Map 2 includes the things that Bob mentioned. It includes the islands in the South China Sea. It includes missile emplacements. It includes claims that we don't recognize and The Hague doesn't recognize, but China recognizes. Will we get to map 4? Because map 4 is always war, right? That's the last map, right? You go from peace to war. Will we get to map 4? Will we get to map 3? That's the process we're engaged in right now. The end game of what China wants is something, I think it's not as physical as toll booths, meaning ships on the sea that stop other ships, but it is recognition of its claims, and it is the surrender of other claims by other nations, and certainly the ability, which it more or less has achieved, that should it choose to do so, absent U.S. intervention, it could materially alter that balance of power. meaning it could stop the Philippines Navy from resupplying their islands if it chose to do so, absent an American security guarantee.
Okay, one last question back there.
Hi, thank you so much for this. This was really great. I'm Emily. I'm from Foreign Policy. And my question is, so the last time we had a new incoming president, it's not that there was no focus on Russia, but we were certainly not as it is now, even though if you recognize legitimacy of nation's own self-conceptions, you sort of might have known that this country is not going to go quietly into the night, right? Similarly, 8 years later, would you say, is it your concern that the American press and policymakers and public are not sufficiently focused on this region? Or rather, there is focus, but it's just misguided, and we're sort of, aside from all of us now who've listened to your talk, don't know which way the wind is blowing?
In Asia, you mean?
In Asia,
In
yep.
Asia. I think it's hard now not to be as focused on Asia. I think that the deterioration in Sino-U.S. relations over the past couple years, it's pushed it to the forefront of CNN and to the forefront of the Washington Post. I think it is now of enough concern that my worry is that we'll only see it as something that can go into these sort of negative trends, that will sort of feel behind the eight ball, and that we really have very few options, whereas I think we have lots of options. We have options with our allies. We have options because of the strengths we bring to the table, the economics, as Paul was bringing out earlier, that we should be taking advantage of. What we do need, though, is a strategy. There actually has not been a full U.S. government strategy for Asia. The last one was in 1998, right, Chip? 1998, you may have been involved with it, back in Office of Secretary of Defense, East Asia came out with an Asia-Pacific strategy. We haven't had one since then. Right? That's 19 years, right? We need a strategy. We need to understand what our interests are, what our equities are, how we're going to pursue them, ends and means, very simple questions, and we haven't done that for a long time. The worst thing, I think, is if we simply react in an ad hoc manner. I think that President-elect Trump is saying lots of things that people will say behind closed doors in times about the competition with China, about that they're not a very helpful partner. He's doing what he's always done, stripping away the niceties. But that's not a strategy. And you need to have a strategy, and you need to come up with it fairly quickly. So I'm not as concerned that we're not paying attention to Asia. It's that I'm not sure we're paying attention to it in a rigorous manner and in a strategic manner. And then I hope that in some small way the book may help, at least to get people to be aware of those questions so that others can take the next step and create that strategy.
Yeah, and I'll just close saying that nobody can predict 40 years out. And you can't predict what's going to happen today or tomorrow unless you have intelligence on what people are deciding. But to me, the focus of journalism, of history writing, of this kind of book, is to make the reader less surprised about what will happen, say, 5 years into the future, the middle-term future. And I can tell you, reading this book, this is a serious attempt to do just that. So I hope all of you read the book, and thank you so much for attending.
Thank you. Thank you.